every now and then I get too big for my britches and I'm like, I'm going to say a programming term that I heard on a podcast. And then I'll sound so smart to them. And I'm wrong every time. And they're like, that's not what that is. They'll say upbeat and they mean they want more activity. They don't necessarily mean faster tempo. The beat itself does not go any faster than I'm already writing, but they want more stuff happening in that space. Engineers and whatnot would kind of very timidly be like, could I could we try this musical? Do you think this would work? And I'm like, I lose my mind when that happens. When people like suggest that, I love that so much.
Hello everyone, my name is Łukasz and this is the Game Engineering Podcast. This time I'm joined by Ryan Ike, an incredible composer and sound designer. Ryan breaks down how music for games is created, and we discuss his phenomenal soundtracks, Where the Water Tastes Like Wine and West of Loathing. Enjoy. How did you find music appealing and how did you ended up in games?
So those are two very different questions, I think, because like
Yeah.
I just naturally gravitated to music since I was a very little kid. My parents, I don't know why. I actually never found out. I should look into the origin of this artifact, but they had this like junky like old organ in their basement. Not like a pipe organ, but just like a little like double layered keyboard in their basement.
Oh.
Um, I think they got it from like a great grandparent of mine or something. I'm realizing on the show. I should find out my own origin story because would you'd find me down there like as a very little kid, as like a 5-year old, just like trying to pick out like the themes to like X-Men and like Power Rangers and like whatever. Like I was, like cartoon shows and stuff at the time. Like I was a ghoul living in the basement, like Phantom of the Opera-ing, cartoon show themes and stuff down there. Like hunting and pecking, right? Like just with like my pointer fingers and stuff because I didn't know what I was doing. And I'm very fortunate that I had the kind of family environment that saw me doing this and instead of going like, "What's wrong with him?" went, you know, uh, we should get this kid some piano lessons. And so I don't know. I'm very aware of the like very fortunate chain reaction of things that I was privy to. Like I'm very grateful for getting a piano teacher. Her name was Julie Larson in my hometown. She was amazing, like super, super knowledgeable, very skilled, but also very like encouraging, like very good at like getting me in the right mindset early to not take mistakes personally, to just like constantly kind of like work on your growth and not take it as a personal thing when you can't do something. Um, you know, moving on through my college and grad school life, like having incredible teachers who just were again like I didn't ever run into that thing for the most part. That like when you read like an inspiring like musician's biography or something, there's always like, and this person said I'd never do it, and I showed them, and like I kind of I have like examples of that I guess like very late in the game, but like I got to skip a lot of that shit, which is really ideal, honestly. If you can speed run becoming a professional musician by skipping all that stuff, like I recommend it. Like not having the asshole who tells you can't do it, like saves you so much time. Um, and so like that was kind of music was a thing for me since I was a very little kid. But I feel like I had this like kind of childish idea of what I wanted to do with it. Because if you asked me like in high school what I wanted to do for a living, I'd be like, oh, I would literally say like music. That's not that's not anything.
That's not specific, yeah.
That's not anything. Like I can't, like I didn't have a concept of what it was. I just knew I wanted something musical, and I think even then, in the back of my mind, a small part of me wanted to write music for a living, but I didn't really nurture that or admit it to myself because it felt like a fantasy. Even having the encouraging environment I had, it felt like a thing where it's like people don't really do that though, and especially like way even further back, like if you take that subconscious part and go to its subconscious part that it's not listening to either, like that part of my brain wanted to write music for video games because that's always been a thing that's been inspiring to
Oh.
me, and like that would be the ultimate cool thing. So I think I knew since I was a kid, at least in high school, but I didn't nurture it or really acknowledge that part of me early on because it felt too painful because it's like, well, that's not going to happen. That's like saying you want to be an astronaut or a football player, which people do become those things, but it felt unrealistic to me even then. And so it was more like I want to do something with music, but something achievable, and I didn't know what that was. And then college, I kind of refined it down to, okay, I want to be a performer. I've been a piano player since I was like 5. Like that's kind of what I want to do is like, I studied music for piano performance. And then like, unfortunately for me, basically like 2 weeks before graduating, finally copped to like, nah, shit, I want to be a composer. Like I really want to write my own stuff. Like that's what I want to do. And I dabbled a little bit in high school, but I hadn't really written much music by this point. Um, my college program didn't have a composition department, and even if they did, they'd be like, "What are you doing here 14 days before you graduate? What are we supposed to do for you?" Um, so they did their best. Like I told my advisor and I told my like piano professor, and she was wonderful. And they did their best to kind of like shop me around to people at the program who like were composers, even though they didn't teach it, and give me like a leg up. But I just realized too late in the game that's what I wanted to do. I got out of college. I went to grad school because I felt like I needed that extra layer of skills. Despite the fact that I am constantly publicly trying to convince people who want to do what I do not to go to grad school, because not that there's anything wrong with higher education. I'm a huge proponent of it. You just super wicked don't need to do it for what I do. Um, like I think I've tricked some people who have followed my path to be like, oh, I should get like a master. Like you should not get a master's in video game music. Like please God, save yourself the $50,000. But I did it because at that point I wanted to be a composer, but I still wasn't admitting to the video game aspect. I still was like, well, that's still unrealistic. I can become a composer and like hopefully, work in small ensemble stuff, and I'll probably have to teach, to support myself as most composers in that scene kind of do, but like I'll get to write like some chamber music or something and like that'll be cool. Uh and San Francisco State, where I went to graduate school, did not have a video game program. They looked at me like an alien when I when I said that's kind of what I was interested in.
What
They
year?
were
What
wonderful.
year? What year was it?
This would have been 2010, like
Okay.
2010 to 2013.
Okay. There are already a
Uh,
couple of games out there. Because,
yeah, and so they were very wonderful instructors. They were very nurturing, but so I'm not trying to talk smack about anybody at that program, but video games was not a thing that was happening there. Uh, And so, it kind of took me till like very late in my education to like finally like admit to myself what I wanted to do. And I credit a lot of that to my wife. I'm very famous for when somebody asks me this question, like, how did you get into games? It's like I married somebody who uh my consistent joke is bullied me into following my dreams because like she basically did that. She was just like, you're not going to be happy if you don't do this thing you want to do. Like, why are you getting like up to this close to the goal? Like, you're trying to become a musician and become a composer, already very difficult things. Why are you not going the extra step and just trying to do music for the thing you want to do? And I didn't have any good answers for that because there weren't any. And so I kind of got out of grad school with compositional and like arrangement and orchestrating skills that I hadn't had before, but no video game background and no background on the technology side because they didn't really teach that at the program. So I knew how to like write physical sheet music and work with performers, and I learned all this really valuable stuff. But when it came time to like sit down at a piece of music software and make music for a video game, I had no clue. I didn't know what mixing was. I didn't know what mastering was. I didn't know how to make music loop, which is a very common thing in video games, so it plays forever. I didn't know how to do layers. I didn't know how to do middleware, which is the software that game composers use to make the music behave how we want in a game without having to know how to program ourselves. Um, I didn't know how to do any of the technological side of it, and so I had to kind of like self-teach myself that stuff. And that was sort of my last step in the process was like denial the entire way and music throughout high school, college, grad school, and then finally like a self-teaching, like year or two where I had to really just sit down and learn a bunch of the technological side because I just never got that instruction at any point.
a year or two. You managed to do this in like less than 2 years?
Oh, Wukash, no, no. I start what I mean is I got far enough that I could fake it to make people think I knew what I was doing in 2 years, and then the actual truth is continuing still to this day,
Okay.
over a decade later, to like cobble together enough know-how on the technological side to make it seem like I'm some kind of professional. But like,
Oh, come on.
uh, it's very validating to talk to other people who do this though, because like nobody knows how to use their software for the most part. Like we all know how to use it, but like everybody has at least one weird basement like corner of their music software of choice where like if you point to it and you go, "What's that do?" They're like, "We don't talk about that." Like the hyper editor, I don't know what that is. Don't look at her. Like, like we all have it. And so like it's just kind of the ongoing process of continually kind of learning and expanding. And if I run into a wall where it's like, I don't know how to do this, like, can I figure it out? Or, more often, can I find somebody who's knowledgeable on this thing who can teach me? And so, uh, it took me 2 years to get that like very, very 101 basic level of like I can kind of mix something. It's bad, but I can do it. I can write something in a DAW and understand, how to put it together, but it's bad. Like I got everything to the I can do it, but it's bad, but I can do it. And that's something I can build on.
Okay. Okay. And then you started to have some sort of projects, actual game dev projects, I assume, like contractor work for writing music for games. This is it.
Yes.
Okay.
So my first project ever was my first project that went anywhere. Excuse me, because I worked on one or two other small things that kind of, as is the case, just with early development when you're working with other people who are new to game dev, things kind of fall apart. It's just what happens as people are learning. I'm learning, they're learning, and development kind of stalls out. That's nobody's fault, really. But the first project I worked on to completion was a game called Gunpoint. With this developer, Tom Francis, who's a British game journalist who wanted to try his hand at making video games and had this very like cool blog where he just was going through the process. And at one point, he was even like, "I think I'll just give this game away for free because I'm just kind of doing it for fun." And his fans literally like convinced him like, "Please sell it," which I think is very cool. And so, um, if you're not familiar with Gunpoint, because in indie game terms, it came out in the Cretaceous period. It is this side-scrolling like puzzle game where you play this sort of like noir detective, like trench coat and the fedora and everything. But he's got all these. It's set in the very near future, so he's got all these like technological gadgets. He's got these hyper trousers, they're called, that let him jump up to the rooftop of buildings, and he's got this device called the crosslink that lets him rewire the electrical connections in a level so you can change it so the button for an elevator doesn't call the elevator anymore. Now when you push it, it sets the alarms off on another floor so the guards go up there, or locks a door when a guard walks into it to inspect, so he's locked inside and you can do things. And so it's all about this like kind of espionage of sneaking into these places, like having fun with the puzzle elements of wreaking havoc with your various gadgets, and then like getting the data and getting out. And Tom posted this. It was kind of unorthodox how I got into this because normally it doesn't work this way. But I was in my self-teaching period, right? And I was teaching piano lessons pretty much full time to support myself, and just kind of writing when I could in the spaces around that. And I happened to see on Twitter, back when Twitter was usable, um, I happened to see that he was a lot of fellow composer and audio types that I was getting to know slowly were posting about this thing that Tom had posted. And I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know Tom Francis. I didn't know Gunpoint, but it was this thing where he posted footage of the game he was working on to YouTube and just invited people to score it, to write music to it and send it to him, and saying that he would hire whichever submission he liked the best. And I was seeing people like C418, like the composer for Minecraft at the time, like the original Minecraft composer, and all these other composers I really looked up to submitting to this. And I had no credits. I was still learning. I was like, there's no chance I'm going to get this, but I'm going to do it as a practicing exercise. Um, and so I did my best. It was kind of like this noir jazz submission with like these synth elements to kind of reflect that it's got this noir, aesthetic, but it's in the near future, and kind of like mixed a lot of like upright bass and like horns and stuff with these like kind of light synth elements. And I was like, I did my best with it and sent it in. And another of that chain of things I'm very grateful for, like the lucky breaks, is that Tom Francis is the kind of developer who is more interested in taking the thing he thinks is the best fit versus the bigger name. So
Ah,
like I wouldn't have blamed him if he had just picked a submission that maybe wasn't his favorite but was by one of these huge names, because that would be helpful for his first time at game development to have C14 or some other big name that has a following already. And instead he I'm very grateful, went with my submission, seemed to think that was a good fit. He picked a couple other musicians, who I'm now friends with, John Robert Matz and Francisco Cerda, who each did a track in the game as well, because he was just like, well, I like this one for the conversation screen, the dialogue screen where you're talking about like debriefing your mission, and I like this track that John wrote for the kind of main theme, and then I did everything else. And that's a very like backdoor, like weird way to get into game dev. Usually there's not like an open call for auditions. For composers. Like it's usually more like it's never, there's never a normal way. There's never like, here's my resume, please hire me. Like that doesn't happen, but uh, it's very unorthodox. And I credit the fact that I, even in those early days, was starting to meet people in the space, like other composers, other hopeful composers and hopeful sound designers, as well as people who were already doing it, other game devs and stuff, so that I had enough of a community, even if a lot of it was online at the time, that I even heard about this thing. Because it was literally just a tweet I saw as I was leaving to go teach my piano lessons for the day. And if I hadn't met enough people who were, in this space and were cool and were like willing to connect with me, I wouldn't have even known about this opportunity. And so it's just one of those things where um, meeting people is like the really key thing to finding any kind of work in the space. Like even if it always ends up being some weird roundabout, you know,
Yeah.
stupid collection of clown car like weird chances and stuff.
Can you break down a little bit more what you needed to do? Was it more like here using this kind of instruments, for example, give me like a soundtrack or just one piece? Like what was the, let's say, the sort of this informal addition open call?
Sure. It was actually like very lacking in instruction, which made it terrifying. Um, but I also kind of like that because it meant, he was posting on this blog all the submissions he was getting, and so I was able to hear everyone else's as well, which was terrifying because still, in my opinion, to this day, a lot of them I feel were better than mine.
Okay.
And it was just footage of the game being played. So this little, noir detective is jumping around in buildings and diverting the guards and using his gadgets and stuff, and that's it. And literally, the instruction was basically just please write music to this, and there was nothing beyond that. There was no like stylistic limits on it. You could derive things like I kind of did from looking at the aesthetics of the actual gameplay and being like, okay, there's no R elements, but it's the future. It's kind of got a mild cyberpunk vibe. It's kind of comedy. It's kind of puzzles. Um, but there was no limiters. There was no kind of like conscription on it, and so that made it both really freeing and like fun, and also kind of like horrifying at the same time because uh, but I think it was effective, for Tom as well because like he got, as you can hear on the blog, like a crazy wide array of things. Like a lot of people went kind of jazzy like I did. But a lot of people did like, more kind of like synthwave kind of 80s, like Vangelis stuff. People did some kind of like more like comedy, almost like Looney Tunes things for it. Like there was a really wide array of things. And I imagine he did that on purpose because it gave him a greater platter of things to kind of choose from and see what was going to be the best fit. And so I just did my best to, having not scored a game at this point, barely understanding how to write music for games, period. Like I knew the basics of like music needs to often loop, it needs to have layers that can transition in and out depending what the player's doing. There's all these different ways to make music interactive, but I hadn't done any of that. And so I just watched the gameplay footage and tried to think like, what would I want to hear if I was playing this? And I watched the footage like a trillion times. Kind of, it was just like I want to say like a 10, 12 minute clip of gameplay with no commentary, no nothing. And I just tried to be like, okay, how long would something have to be so that if I was playing this game a lot, I wouldn't want to throttle me, right? Because that's a big concern for for composers. Is like, how long do I have to make the music so people don't come to my house with pitchforks? Um, and so, I started there, and then I thought about like, okay, how do I make this like loop effectively in a way that's going to be engaging? Uh, and then one of the things I tried to do was be like, when this main device you have, the cross-link that lets you rewire stuff, when you use that, like that's the key mechanic of the game. Even at that point in that early footage, it was like when you turn this on, the whole level kind of turns like a film negative, sort of like you
Okay.
can see all the circuit pathways and stuff like in the walls, like what connects to what thing. Um, and I was like, that's a really cool effect, and it's clearly like very key to this game. Like, how can I try to, if I was playing this, wouldn't I want that to be reflected in the music in some way? And I did like a very vestigial version of this because we ended up actually doing something more in line with what I was thinking, like once I was actually hired on, but trying to kind of like include these synth elements so that it felt like it was reflecting like a more electronic kind of aesthetic when you turn this like sci-fi device on that lets you change what light switch controls what thing and that kind of stuff. And so the best kind of starter point I had as someone who didn't know what he was doing at all was just like what I don't know how to write music for games, but I played so many of them. What would I want as a player? Like what would I want this to do for me? Like how would I want it to put me in the mood? How would I want it to kind of reflect the sort of like Looney Tunes comedy of this game that's sort of on display with like how chaotic and frenetic things can get when guards catch you? How would I want it to be engaging but not annoying? That was all stuff I felt like I could do. It was just the technical side of like, and it needs to loop and not sound like garbage when it does it, and it needs to like, reflect the gameplay without being like clunky and stupid. And so like that was where I really struggled was like the technical side of it. I was still
Okay.
learning.
Okay. Can we do a bit of a tangent from the story to actually this very concept? Because when you're saying that this submission was like there were zero instructions really, I can relate as an engineer. Like I have in my process how to build a game from scratch, even like 3D game, like what needs to happen, GPU, how it's supposed to work. And if you ask me like what music would be good for this game, I have like blank mind. Like you will get blank stare. It's like I have no idea. So can you tell me a little bit more about this process of like you seeing something as a game, visuals, mechanics, and matching this to the music or sound? Like, is this, by the way, the sound design? Like, this is the process of sound design uh, to actually understand what would be the common themes, like musical themes in the game?
That's a very good question. So I mean, yeah, usually when we and forgive me if I'm misunderstanding, like usually when we say sound design, we mean the actual production of like sound effects, like in more specific, but on a broader, more general term, like audio design, like thinking about like what do I want this audio experience to be? Like you're absolutely right. Like that's
Okay.
kind of like the top outermost layer of what we do if we're trying to be holistic about it is not just like, oh, this would be cool to do this theme here, or if this sound effect happened in this way and had like these effects on it, whatever. Like that comes way later. It's like zooming out, and being like, what do I want the experience to be? What thematic and emotional content do I want to get across with this? And how can I support the player with this?
Okay.
Whether it's, and that question on its own is one that I try to ask myself really early on, and that involves a lot of, follow-up questions like how much do I want the music to be spotlighted? Right? Like, because a lot of times the key thing to do as a game composer is like make music that works and is fitting, but gets out of your way. Like,
Oh.
um, which is still a struggle for me, frankly, because I'm, lifelong musician. I'm like, but I wrote this and I want people to hear it. And sometimes it's like, yeah, you wrote something really good that you like then put like a curtain over, like you're trying to put a bird to sleep, and you just put it in the corner and be like, yeah, people can kind of hear it, but they're not supposed to like really hear it. Like don't look at it, just kind of like know it's there. And
Okay.
that's still an alien concept to me because everything else I was learning in my kind of like music education career was like, well, yeah, you're on a stage, under a spotlight, like playing piano, and people are like looking right at you. And then I decided to divert at the end to like, I'm going to put all of my skills and work and research into making something that you don't always want someone to listen to directly, you know? So
Okay.
like that's part of it is like how focused are we on the music? What are the themes of the game? Is it just about gameplay? Is it like, you know, when you're playing Sudoku, you're not worried about like what is the pathos here? Like do these numbers have a family that they're trying to avenge in this puzzle? It's just like, no, I'm just here to like have a fun time. But in other games, there's like a story element. And so like, are you worried about character themes? Are you worried about like reflecting history and trying to kind of build a world? Or are you just kind of trying to support like just core gameplay? Like there's all these different questions about like what is the music supposed to do? When is it appropriate to spotlight it? Like when is that going to enhance the play experience? Because there's plenty of times when that's what you want to do is like have the music be one of the key things you're experiencing in that moment, like whether it's like a triumphant moment in gameplay or it's a cutscene or something. And then there's lots of other times where it's like, how can I help the player like settle into a vibe essentially without distracting them from what they're doing, without making it about me. And so like that's a lot of it. It's a lot of like cross-disciplinary communication. Um, which I really like doing, but it's it's a lot of like talking to engineers like yourself and talking to game designers and talking to, people on the team and being like, what does this mean to you? And like how finding out how the other people on your team are also supporting these ideas. Because if I'm like, okay, I've got it. This is a game about like being like a thief in medieval times and kind of trying to feed your family. And so I'm going to fill it with like a lot of pathos and like, try to like use a lot of medieval instruments, but also like character themes. Da, da, da. And I'm like off in my own world doing that. And then I talk to everybody else and they're like, this is like a match three puzzle game about being a thief in medieval. What's wrong with you? Like if I didn't talk, if I don't talk to them, I might go buck wild and do something really cool that
Okay.
doesn't work for this at all. Right. And so that's another big part of it is like communicating with everybody on the team. Sometimes people have really full formed ideas and they're like, oh yeah, game designers will be like, it's like this and we want these themes and that kind of thing. And then other times, which I think is way more fun, is when they're like, we have the basics, but we're going to kind of like hash it out together, you know? And as a composer, I'm not always taking like the lead on that stuff, but it's really fun to be there in that early stage of game design to be able to go like, oh, and then musically we could do this if we do things this way and like kind of get to help like build from the ground up. And so I feel like you end up with a better game and especially like a better soundtrack when you get to do that.
Okay. Can we
Did that
then?
answer your question at all?
Yes,
Because
yes,
okay,
but
great.
I think my follow-up questions will help me also with this one. Uh, can we break down West of Loathing and then Where the Water Tastes Like Wine soundtracks and like what have you faced in terms of like what you needed to write music for? What you thought about like the style? How did you match this to the music? Like what were the goals and things like that? Like breakdown. Just like how did you think about making this soundtrack?
Sure. Yeah, I like that you picked those two as well because those are like those two games I was working on simultaneously. And really
Oh,
briefly
really?
for listeners who, yeah, I was working on them at the same time, which was we can get into that because that was I basically needed to like put a sheet of construction paper between the two halves of my brain and be like, you stay over here and you stay over there because this is really messing me up to work on these two things at the same time. Um, for listeners who maybe don't know, really briefly, West of Loathing is like a cowboy like Western, RPG, but it's like a comedy game. All the art is stick figure art on purpose. It's loaded with jokes. Like the whole point of it is to be a funny game, and I think it really succeeds at that. It looks like it's drawn on a napkin on purpose, right? And then where the water tastes like wine is this very like deep emotional game about telling and sharing stories like in a kind of mildly fantasy version of the American like Great Depression. And it's kind of like, you know, playing with time a little bit. So like you'll meet characters from as early as like the late 1800s to like the 1960s as you travel across America, like riding the boxcars and stuff and talking to characters. And it was the whole idea was to be about stories and about all the different people who make up like America at that time and who are like searching for an American dream that like isn't, spoiler spoiler for America, I guess, isn't really accessible or achievable for a lot of people. Um, and so one of those things is very, very needs to be treated with a lot of like respect in a specific way. Like we had people from all these, we had so many writers on that game that were from all these different backgrounds, writing characters who were immigrants and who were, black and dealing with like slavery and post-slavery America and who were extremely disadvantaged poor folks or handicapped people or all these different people from these different walks of life that we wanted to represent with care and with respect, and that went to the music as well. uh, and then at the same time I'm doing like this goofy uh, stick figure game and they both get lumped into like Western music. They're not both really, if I'm being picky. Like one is West of Loathing is explicitly like a Western soundtrack, like what you'd hear in a cowboy movie. And then Where the Water Tastes Like Wine has a lot of folk music, but a lot of that still represents, for a lot of people, it still kind of grokks the same, right? It's still guitar, banjo, the sounds you would hear in a Western soundtrack. So a lot of people kind of put them both together. And so it was an interesting challenge, especially to do these both simultaneously, because I'll start with West of Loathing. The thing I really enjoyed about that was my first like explicitly comedy game. Like Gunpoint had comedy elements. It's a funny game. Like I laughed playing it at how chaotic it gets. But West of Loathing is explicitly like everybody you talk to, there's jokes in the dialogue, there's jokes in the environment, there's jokes in your items and your abilities, and like everything is meant to be funny. Um, and you're playing this adventurer who's in this, like comedy stick figure version of the Wild West, and we're playing with all these tropes. And I spent so much time being like, okay, how do I make the soundtrack funny? And I kept doing like, a Western soundtrack with like steel guitar and like driving like timpanis and all the stuff you expect to hear, but like I'd put like goofy kind of percussion instruments in there to try to make it sound funny, and that didn't work. And then I'd do like, okay, what if I do like a Western, but it's bad? And I what if I make the music bad on purpose, which is uh not something I'm good at. I make stuff, bad by accident all the time, as all creative people do, but on purpose is difficult. Um, and that didn't work. And I just kept trying all these different things to be like, how do I make this funny? And the thing I landed on uh, that I should have realized was going to be the thing from the start, because it works in so many other comedy things, is to take the music super, super serious and try to like write a Western score as if I'm writing for like the next big like Western epic movie that's gonna like win Oscars and stuff. And so like just go really hard. Like I did like the kind of like good, the bad, and the ugly, like vocals and stuff that you would expect. I had like, you know, just like big swelling like choruses for some tracks. And I tried to just do these really like emotional guitar lines and just really take it serious, because then when you juxtapose that with how dumb everything in the game is, like that's where the money's at. Like that was what ended up unlocking that for me. It was like, of course, like every other comedy thing does this. I don't know why it took me so long, but like taking it super serious is the thing that made the music funny and made everything happening to the music funnier to me. And so I was, my first time doing that, it took me a while to get to it, but then it was like extremely fun to be like, okay, look at this scene that is all stick figure art, and they're like, you're arguing with a two-headed like cow who's literally from hell, who's here to like, uh, yeah, cast a curse on you or whatever, and be like, how do I pretend that Jeff Bridges is in this? And you know, Cass is the cow. Obviously, he's got a lot of range, and just try to like take this like super serious. And so like that was really fun. And then meanwhile, where the water tastes like wine, like we had so much music that was for like West of Loathing. I wrote music for the game as a whole, kind of, if that makes sense. Like I wrote different themes for different areas and different scenarios, of course, and like tried to tailor everything. But largely, like that soundtrack is more kind of one big piece. Like it's very serious Western music for a goofy comedy Western game. And then Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, like everything is much more specific. Like you meet a character as your character is cursed to wander America in this fantasy Great Depression and talk to all these people and share stories with them as you're kind of like all riding the rails together and stuff. And you meet a character and they tell you their story, and everybody has some kind of tragic backstory or is from a disadvantaged background or something like that. And I want to write music for each of these characters and have it map to their culture as best I can. And so for that game, it wasn't just enough for me. Like it didn't feel satisfactory to be like, okay, this character is a black sharecropper in like post slavery deep South America. Like, he's technically, is told like, okay, this is your farm now, this is your crop, but it's not really. Like they take, the majority of his profits, they take the majority of like his output. He's still basically working under slavery terms and just called a free person. And like this was a common historical thing. And so like how do I write music for this character that is like respectful of that and isn't just like trying to play it being serious? Like another character is like uh a preacher, like a black preacher who's trying to like keep people's kind of spirits up and still preach like, something like a message of hope to people who are him and his congregation are both extremely disadvantaged. And I wanted to do like a gospel track for his section, but I was like, I don't know anything about that. And like that's one of my favorite things as a composer, is to like when I have to write music I don't know anything about, is to take a swing at that. Like that's, I truly enjoy that, but I was like, I can't just take a swing at this for fun. Like I want to get this right. And so the key on that soundtrack was and again, I'm very grateful and fortunate that I got the opportunity to do this, was working with performers from or knowledgeable about a lot of these different backgrounds. So in that gospel example, I worked with a blues and gospel singer named Kenya, who not only did an incredible job performing on that track, but also was willing to, part of hiring these folks was me kind of being upfront and being like, "Hi, I look like me, and I'm clearly not from this background, and I want to get it right. Are you willing to like help me and have this be more of a collaborative thing? Like I'm gonna write stuff, but if you feel like I'm getting it wrong, I kind of would like to be called out. Are you cool with doing that?" And like I over and over, I ended up finding performers who were like, "Hell yeah, I'll tell this Four Eyes to like go back to the drawing board if I have to." And like it was so rewarding. And so like on that track, Kenya was very good about being like, actually, we probably wouldn't use this chord structure. We'd do something a little bit different here because
Oh,
this
that's
is
deep.
like yeah, like this is traditionally how like gospel music would sound at this time, and like it made me so much more at ease too to have kind of an expert in each thing I was dabbling in because I didn't want to just be like the white guy who comes in and goes like, yeah, this is what gospel sounds like. This is what like Navajo music sounds like. Like, that was another one. We had a Navajo character who is on this long, like grim march to kind of get back to her land that was taken from her. Again, a lot of these are based on historical things that really happened. And that was called the Trail of Tears. And it's so important to get this right. And so I ended up working with a really amazing Navajo performer who played like, traditional Navajo flute and again was willing to work with me and make sure I understood the kind of cultural significance of like how this music would be played, like why it would be played, and was willing to kind of correct me here and there and be like, actually, we wouldn't use, I think I had like way too much percussion in that track the first time. And he was like, actually, we'd probably just have like at most like, just like a single hand drum or maybe like a shaker or two. And I was like, cool. And like I pared it way down and like, so it was both of these soundtracks were really important for me to get right, quote unquote. Like every soundtrack I work on, I want to get what's fitting, but it was just interesting to do these at the same time because one was so steeped in a bunch of different cultures and a bunch of different real experiences, even if there's fantasy elements and stuff, like these are based on real experiences people from all these different walks of life and all these different cultures had in America. And I want to be respectful of that and working with people who knew what those musical traditions were was really the key there. And then at the same time, West of Loathing, it's the it's stick figures, remember? But
I can't imagine you working both at the same time. Like I can like
it
they're so apart. You need to like swap like
it scrambled my brain pretty good. A fun kind of a whoopsie that came out of that was that I did very briefly for like one line of music I plagiarized myself on both games. There's like one guitar theme that is the closest to something you'd hear in Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, but it's in West of Loathing. It's like this kind of morose guitar theme when you're in this lonely like ghost town. And I wrote it for that game. But then at some point, like this was like a year or two later, while I was still working on Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, I wrote a guitar part for somebody, and I was at a conference with the lead developer, and he was listening through some of the stuff, and he was like, "Didn't you do this in West of Loathing?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And I had to come over and listen to it and be like, "Oh my God, what?" And he thought it was funny. Like he didn't, it wasn't like it was ruining some character's theme. It was just like one little guitar line, but I was like, I totally ripped myself off because am so fucked up, like writing, trying to do like serious emotional
yeah.
guitar that reflects the pathos of the American experience. And also over here, there's a napkin art fish monster trying to attack you, and he gets a banjo too. And so, like,
Yeah.
it happens sometimes. At least it wasn't Star Wars or something that I plagiarized where I'm not going to sue myself. So everything
Yeah.
worked out okay.
Yeah. Okay. Uh can we dive deeper into how it usually works? Because you worked on more projects. Maybe we don't want to like cover them one by one, but try to extract the essence from them. I was wondering like at what stages of the game development you usually like chime in terms of like thinking about the music, where the music would be important, what are the themes that should be for the music? Like, how does it look like in terms of like whole game development process, where the music creation comes and where it's being tested, like when it's being tested?
Sure. That's a really good question. It largely isn't always my call. Like if I had my say, composers and audio people would get hired almost right away, like as soon as the team is being formed, which does sometimes happen. And I always appreciate when it does. What has happened in the past, sometimes, depending on the project, is a composer like me will get brought on, you know, super roughly, let's say like halfway through development. Like things are a good ways along. Like there's a lot of gameplay. There's maybe a vertical slice by this point. Like they largely know what the game is, what the gameplay is, what themes they're going with, all that stuff. And then they bring someone like me in, and this has happened to me a few times. And like I'm not trying to sound harsh again, on these teams and these projects, because like it's a perfectly fine way to do things. Like um no one was intending kind of any ill will with this. It's just what happens sometimes. And I get brought in uh at that point, like there's not a lot of room to, yeah, the game's kind of already there, right? Like there's not a lot of room for me to be like, well, what if we did this musical idea, but it would cause like us to create a lot of like, you know, uh, the engineers are going to kill me. Speaking of people showing up at my house with pitchforks, because like we have to suddenly like rip their code apart to like fit this new mechanic in where the music like changes when the player does this and this and that thing, and like it becomes kind of limited in what I can do. And so projects like that tend to be, I'm going to write the best soundtrack I possibly can, but it's going to be minimally interactive. It's kind of just like a good, it's kind of like a good soundtrack, hopefully being laid on top of this already functioning and half created game. Um, and that can be good. That like some of my favorite games have soundtracks that are kind of like that, and I've written soundtracks that I'm proud of that are kind of like that. Like I'm not saying that that always ends up with bad work. But what I much prefer is when audio people like me are brought in really early, even from like, day one, so that we have the space to, because I think I would imagine you would agree, like making a game is kind of like just a bunch of people screwing up together over and over until, until something good comes out, hopefully. Um,
Yeah, it's prototyping. That's prototyping. Yeah.
Thank you. That's the that's the much more respectable word for that. And composers like me, like I want to be there for that. I want to be there to do that failing with everybody from the beginning, so that we can come up with something more kind of holistic, where the music is a more integral and interwoven part of things. So that's when you get something kind of like uh, an example would be Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. Like I was brought on like before there was any game at
Okay.
all. Like that music, they were clearly thinking of music as a key kind of integral part of what they wanted this experience to be. And like so I got brought on like very early, like before there was much game to even really look at. Like it was still like very early, just kind of sketchbook sort of days. And then, another one would be like Wizard with a Gun. Like that was in production for a little bit before I got brought on, but like they still brought me in very early, to the point where it wasn't just like this area needs music, that area needs music, this boss fight needs music. Like they did. But I also got to be like, what if the music changed in this way when enemies show up and it's time for combat? What if when we had this chaos mechanic in that game where the world starts to end as you're fighting these magical forces of kind uh, of chaos and entropy, and as they begin to kind of take hold of the world and everything comes apart, it's like, what if the music got wilder and creepier and started to like fall apart and like sound like it was like getting overtaken by static and glitches and all these things, and like the soundtrack itself sort of starts to unravel. Like those are things I wouldn't get to do when I'm brought on later, because either I just don't have time to like think of stuff like that. It's just like, nope, this just needs a theme for the chaos and that's it. And I'll do my best to make that good. Or it's a thing where the game is so kind of set in stone that like to do something like that, again, all the engineers are going to be like, I'm like, don't go to sleep tonight because I'm going to find you. And I don't blame them, because they have so much stuff. Like it's so much work to undo the layers of game design that are in place at that point, if I'm brought in late. But early in development, I can think of stuff like that, and we can build it together. And I can talk to the engineers and be like, hear why it's a difficult or not so hot idea for what we're doing early on, which is also what happens sometimes where like they'll be like, actually, here's why that is very difficult or wouldn't work for what we're doing because da 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 da. And then it's like, oh, cool. And then I can iterate in turn and be like, well, okay, what if we did this thing instead? And like I have room to find out why my ideas might not work either from people who know better and then can pivot. And so it gives that's that thing I was talking about. It gives me space to fail and come up with things that don't work so I can get to the stuff that's going to be cooler and more dynamic, right? So instead of it just being like, yeah, music plays when you do this and when you do this, and hopefully it's good, Ryan did his best. Like that's cool. And a lot of players don't really even feel like they want more than that or notice more than that, and that's perfectly okay. But like I want the thing where it's yeah, but like when the player does this, I want the music to change and respond to them. And when the game state changes from this to this, I want the music that's already playing to change with it. I don't want it to just be like, here's a new piece of music that I put on top. I want it to be, you know, I don't want to just frost a cake. I want to get to like
Yeah,
whisk eggs and mix flour and salt and sugar and all that stuff with everybody.
yeah, that's
I
so
got to stop
cool.
doing food analogies because now I'm hungry.
That's so cool because like you can then really make the game dependent on the music, and music can be like function to really like highlight specific moments that are key to gameplay as well, right? Like it's not like an aftermath in this regard. It's like if you start with music from day one, you get to like involve it so much in so much deeper way. Can you tell me what about sound effects? Like how do they connect to music? Do you do sound effects as well, or
I do.
okay? So how how do you think of them? Like, do they obviously need to match the music, right? But they are much different than like loops of musics that will go forever usually. So how the design looks like for sound effects?
Sure. Yeah, I think because I consider myself primarily a composer, I tend to other sound designers might disagree with me, but I tend to look at what the music is doing and use that as sort of a template for what the sound effects should sound like. And so just add some sound designers to the crowd of people outside my apartment with pitchforks if they're mad at me about this. But that's what I tend to do. And so if the say the music is like very I don't know, I'm writing a soundtrack that's very harsh and has a lot of like distortion and a lot of like glitchy effects and a lot of kind of like I want everything to sound like there's a lot of friction and a lot of like rough edges on things. I'm gonna try to make sound design that matches that. I'm gonna try to make sound design that also sounds like it, and I will often use a lot of the same like plugins, the same software. If I have like a distortion plugin I'm putting on a guitar or a keyboard part or a synth part or something, I find that a lot of my sound design work sounds like it's more of a piece with the whole soundtrack. If I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna use that same distortion plugin, like the amp I ran my sampler guitar through. What happens if I run these sounds I recorded through this same amp? And I feel like that helps kind of things sound like they're playing with each other instead of just like here's a soundtrack and then also separately here's some sounds I made for the same game. They're coming from the same person, and I want them to kind of play with each other. The challenge with that for me, and I think you know me being primarily a composer, that might be part of why this is a challenge specifically. But if I am making a soundtrack and it's got a certain flavor to it, uh, say that it's really like soft and saturated. I want it to sound like an 80s kind of like synth wave thing. So it's got a lot of low end, it's got a lot of saturation. Sounds very warm and kind of liquid. And then I want the sound effects to also have that quality to them. And I'm using a lot of the same software to make them sound that way. I'm using a lot of the same EQing and mixing techniques to give them that same warm, saturated sound. Now, between the music and the sound effects, there's a lot of audio content living in that low end of the like sound frequency range, right? A lot of like that part of the EQ meter is like lighting up
Okay.
all the time between the music living in that low end and the sound effects wanting to live down there too. And so it's like that doesn't work because now everything's kind of fighting audio wise in the same space, right? And so sometimes it's a big challenge to be like, okay, I want everything to sound warm and saturated and have a lot of low end, but I can't do that with everything because if I do it with the music and the sound effects, they'll fight. and you won't really hear either if they're playing at the same time. So I have to kind of try to remember to step back at that point and be like, okay, well, why do I want things to sound low and saturated like this? And it's like, well, because we're in this example, like say we're doing like an 80s, you know, aesthetic like cyberpunk game. It's like, okay, so instead of everything being explicitly what the music is doing to reflect that, which is being like very warm and saturated, and like kind of like the Blade Runner soundtrack would be a great example. Uh, how can I reflect? How can I take a step back and be like, what sounds like a kind of retro 80s cyberpunk aesthetic for sound effects that isn't using those same attributes as the music is using? The music is going low end, the music is going saturated, kind of sounding like it's coming from like an analog tape or something. How can I use some of that on the sound effects, but then do other things that reflect an 80s cyberpunk aesthetic that aren't going to fight the soundtrack? And it's like, okay, so a lot of the sound effects actually have to be in the higher frequency range. Like that's the first thing is be like, music is low range, sound effects have to play in the other end of the EQ spectrum so that they're not fighting each other. And then be like, okay, I want things to sound kind of like retro and lo-fi. What if I make a lot of the sound effects warp? What if I use a plugin to make it sound like when you play a tape and you speed it up or slow it down, it kind of like changes it warbles and that kind of thing. Like what if I do that to the sound effects? That's not going to conflict with what the music is doing. Music isn't necessarily doing that, but it still is like the same aesthetic, but different aspects of it, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the biggest challenge for me is being like, I want these to sound like they are family, the music and the sound effects, but like if I do the exact same things to make the music fit this aesthetic and then make the sound effects fit this aesthetic with the same exact techniques, they fight each other. And so I have to be like, find a complementary set of things that make each element sound like it's from the same larger aesthetic, whatever the game is trying to support, in a way that, you're kind of like fitting in different pieces in a puzzle is sort of how I think of it. So that way, like, yeah, it's the same picture at the end, but you're not trying to like jam two pieces into the same like open hole. That makes sense. I'm sorry I said hole on your podcast.
It's okay. Because I am an engineer, I find it difficult to discuss the audio subjects. Maybe because, like, for example, for engineer minds, I can easily switch to like using engineer words and nomenclature and like words that other engineers understand. And I have a lot of friends that are from, let's say, instrument slash orchestra world. And when there's like when they start to discuss things related to orchestra, I immediately don't understand because they are like, they start to use just different words. And I was wondering, like, what did you find effective in terms of discussing with game designers or game developers that what are your techniques to discuss music with
Sure.
people that don't have this background?
That's literally one of my favorite topics. I'm actually giving a talk with a bunch of other folks in the industry about that at GDC this year about like
Oh,
communicating across disciplines. We have like a project manager and an engineer and a sound designer and a collection of different people talking about that very thing. Like, how do we communicate with each other when we have different languages, like different professional languages, right? Because I'm the same way. When I go to talk to my engineer friends and I every now and then I get too big for my britches and I'm like, I'm going to say a programming term that I heard on a podcast. And then I'll sound so smart to them and I'm wrong every time. And they're like, that's not what that is. And I'm like, I know. Why did I do that? Um, and so I'm the same way when I try to like, if I'm discussing with an engineer like a gameplay problem where we're trying to figure out how to make the music interact with this thing and they're using their language that's inherent to them about programming and code and like engineering concepts and I'm trying to use musical language and it's just like we're sort of two different sims kind of just like saying garbled like like lunar language at each other but not really understanding. And so uh one of the big things that kind of unlocked this for me was understanding that even though people think they're saying the same thing, especially when they talk about like something like music, visual arts, and then me when I talk about programming, they think they're using a word that is universal, but it's not universal. So like an example will be uh, a common one for me is when I'm working with a developer and they're like, we just want this track that you're working on to be more upbeat. And that word has ruined my life on a number of occasions because and it's nobody's fault, right? But like I've had developers just keep saying like I want it more upbeat, can you make it more upbeat. And to me, a musician, and this doesn't even mean that I'm right. Other musicians will disagree with me, but like upbeat means faster, like a faster tempo. Literally just the beat is going to increase. I'm gonna crank the speed up. And but to and maybe like give it a more kind of happy like a major, write it in a major key and give it like, more of a kind of happy emotional state, like a more joyful atmosphere. Like those are things that can mean upbeat. For other people, including people I've worked with in the past who are not necessarily musicians, they'll say upbeat and they mean they want more activity. They don't necessarily mean faster tempo. The beat itself does not go any faster than I'm already writing, but they want more stuff happening in that space. Or they might mean an emotional state like changing the key, or they might mean literally a couple of times that has meant, can you transpose it? Like they didn't know that word, but they meant like, here's the key we're in. Say I'm in C major. I wish this was higher up. Can you make it in D major? Can you move everything up by like a pitch, a whole step? And like that's what I mean. It's nobody's wrong. Everybody's version of what upbeat means to them is correct to them, and it's not necessarily no one's using that word wrong, but they mean different things. And especially when you're someone like me who works in one space and I hear that word, I think specific things. Someone else might mean something different. And so, and this happens all the time across disciplines. People say a word that they think is universal. They're like, I'm not using jargon. Everyone knows the word upbeat. Uh, but you have a collection of things that that word means to you. The other person has a collection of things that word means to them. And then someone like me goes, cool, I'll make it more upbeat. I go and do it. And I come back and they're like, no, that's not it. And I'm confused because I'm like, but I did exactly what you said. And it's like, that we're not talking about the same thing. And so for me, the absolute most helpful thing has been audio examples. And being, like talking with a developer or an engineer and being like, we want this music to be flowier. We want it to be, we could use that term upbeat. We want it to be menacing. Whatever we're trying to get out of it. I'm like, cool. Can you send me some music? It could be from YouTube, Spotify, it could be a commercial, it could be literally anything. I don't care, but like get me some links or some clips or something of music that you think exemplifies this idea. And then the pivotal thing I found is I need some kind of qualifying statement. So like that upbeat example would be someone would send me some music that to them is upbeat, and then I want a qualifier that's like this, but, or
Okay.
like this and specifically this part, or like this, but also like, and then a second piece, right? And so like that has been like the ultimate thing that has unlocked it for me, because like there have been so many times doing this where I've been working with someone and they'll be like, okay, I'll send you stuff, but I don't know how to make it any clearer. And then they send me music that is, say we're trying to make something sound menacing. And I'm like, I think I have a collection of things as a musician that I know makes something sound menacing. uh, you know, it's going to go slower. It's going to have this kind of like driving, sharp percussion that makes it sound like something's coming at you. It's going to be in a minor key with a lot of dissonance. Like, cool, I can make something more menacing, and I keep getting it wrong. And then I've had the person I'm working with be like, okay, well, fine, I'll send you an example, but I don't know how to make it clearer. And I get the audio example, and within 4 seconds, I'm like, oh my God, that's what they mean. And like literally, it's like we want it slower and we want lower pitches and we want this to be less melodic. We want it to be more of like an like there's all these different things where it's like those also mean menacing, right? They're not wrong. But my go-tos for achieving the thing they're saying are not the same as what they wanted. And so getting an example, now we're both listening to audio, the thing I'm trying to make also. And it's like it gets us on the same page so fast. And then the qualifying statement is so important because it means that I don't focus on the wrong thing. Because before I started making people do that, they'd send an audio example and I'd be like, oh, cool, I see what you mean. And I would do the thing that I think their example is showing me. And a lot of times that would work, but sometimes they'd still be like, no, that's not it. Like, did you listen to the thing? I'm like, yes, I listened to the thing. And so like once I started making people be like, hey, could you be like, but and something. And once they start being like this clip, but oftentimes that's the final clue I need where I'm like, okay, like this clip, but this thing I focused on in that clip is not what they mean. They actually like the fact that it's got this piano part over the top and it's got this kind of like tinkly fantasy element. And like I didn't even think they meant that at all, but okay, cool. And like that's the key thing is give me audio examples and a qualifying thing as to what specifically about them you like and what you want changed about it, you know,
Okay.
but and etc. And then usually that's the fastest way. Like ever since I started doing that, I'm pretty decent at like landing something somebody wants in like one go. Not all the time, but like usually it's like, oh cool, like I'm on the same page as you, and like then we can get off to it.
Okay. Okay. So, my other question was like, what do you need from game designers to write effective music? But I guess this somewhat largely covers it. Do you have any other things that you usually like require from game designers if they come to you?
I wouldn't call it a requirement, but a thing that's always lovely is just curiosity. Like I think I'm guilty of this sometimes, and I bet a lot of people in different disciplines are too, where like, you know, you're working on a team to make something, but it's very easy to just kind of be head down and just do your thing. Like I certainly get that way sometimes where I'm like, yep, I'm gonna just head down on music and audio and just kind of interface with the other people on my team when I think my what I'm making crashes into what they're making. You know, I try not to do that, but I've been guilty of that in the past. And I think a thing I always appreciate, um, including when I do it too, is just curiosity. When it's like, hey, it can be anything from like, what if we did this? Like I've worked on teams like the Wizard with a Gun team had a lot of people who were really great about being like, could we do a musical thing like this? And they're not like telling me. It's not even necessarily a suggestion. It's like, would this even work? And I'm like, oh, that could work. And then that gets me thinking about like additional ideas and like we're kind of like workshopping a music thing together. I feel like a thing I run into a lot is like people feel afraid to, unless they're like the head dev, they feel afraid to like suggest musical stuff. I don't know if that's true of everyone, but I've run into that a lot where like engineers and whatnot would kind of very timidly be like, could I could we try this musical? Do you think this would work? And I'm like, I lose my mind when that happens. When people like suggest that, I love that so much because it's like I'm over here in my little like goblin like music closet. Like you thought about me, you know? Like it is really validating actually, and it's great because like I want to talk about this stuff. I don't want to just be like, you can't suggest anything to me. I'm the music expert here. Like you can't, you know, like I want because you know we're making a game that is not for music experts. We're making a game for players, and like they're going to hear it, they're going to experience it. I want to hear what other people on the team have to say, and the same way that I'm the same way when I approach like a programmer or something. I'm very timid because I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm just like, could we have a system where, what if we, and you know, even if they're like, here's why that wouldn't work, and often they're like, that would be kind of cool actually. Like it's still very engaging to. I feel so much more connected to a team when we feel free to like ask each other questions and just show curiosity. Um, even on the West of Loathing team, I'm still working with those folks at Asymmetric Games, and they're very good about just on our team calls. Almost every week, they're like, "What is a Neapolitan chord?" It's not even like,
Yeah.
"Could we do music this way in this game?" They just have generic music questions for me sometimes, like, "How do people have to put their chin on the violin like that, or what?" And I'm like, I love it so much, and it makes me feel more connected to them, but it also on a larger scale, it fosters a relationship of like, oh, cool. Like, I'm not just in charge of the music and no one touch me, which is not what I want. Like, I'm on a team. These people are curious about what I do, and it fosters me being more curious about what they do. And it means we're going to ask more questions of each other. And then it means we're going to, hopefully, all of us make way better stuff. Like the teams, like Wizard with a Gun, where I've had people who are curious like that about what I do, whether it's can you do this thing in this game? Would that be cool? Do you like that idea? Or just how does this thing work that you do? I think we would all be better off uh, if we tried to kind of like across disciplines just ask each other more like basic questions about like how does this work when you do this? Um, and I so it's not a requirement, but I love when it happens, and I feel like I always write better music for a game I'm on when I'm on a team that does that stuff because it brings me out of my shell too.
Tangential question to this one.
I love tangents.
Uh, do you then prefer to work on site? Because like this communication happens much more often inside an office, right? Like how
Mhm.
does it look like?
It's a good one. Do I prefer? It's like I prefer. I think my ideal is like a hybrid situation because I'm loud by nature, and I have, you can't see it on screen, but I have so much stuff. I have these huge speakers. I've got this audio interface. I have a huge keyboard below the screen here. I don't need all of this to make music all the time. I have a little portable setup, but like it's much easier in my studio space with all of my toys and stuff. And so for that reason, I prefer working remote most of the time just because it's much easier, like especially if I'm in a studio space and I'm doing sound design or live recordings or something. Um, Again, just make the pitchfork crowd outside my apartment even bigger. Like the number of people who would be like, yo, he's got to stop. If they had to hear me every time I wanted to like bang on something and record it, like it'd be cute the first couple of times. But unless we had a specific space in a studio for me to go and like be loud. Um, so a lot of my work I think actually does, I do better at my home studio just because of the isolation of not making people want to kill me. But uh on Wizard with a Gun, that's a local team here in Seattle, Galvanic Games. And when I was working with them, I tried to go into the office, especially like in the earlier days, like once a week, and just bring my little portable setup. And I really loved that. Like it made it a little harder to do music and sound stuff. You know, I had to kind of like plan ahead and try to have work for those days that I could mostly do over my headphones, like editing stuff and mixing that kind of thing. And that was fine. But it meant that I was just there with the team and I was not only able to more easily ask questions, but just also like the I'm not trying to sound like some CEO who's like, we all need to come back to the office after COVID, but like there is an element for me who's normally in my music closet, being a goblin at home, like being on the team and seeing these other people and getting to joke around with them and talk about design ideas and even like pull somebody over and be like, do you want to take a listen to this? Like I value that so much. And so it's maybe not realistic, especially because a lot of the teams I work with are based all over the country and just literally there is, being a composer is often a very remote job. So it is not often I even end up with a team that is close enough that I could uh, work in office, but like when I can find like a hybrid situation like that, like, oh, cool, you're local. Do y'all mind if I bring my portable setup and like come in every now and then, a couple times a month and just like hang and try to work there? Like that's my ideal because then I have, no one wants to hear me like dry heaving into a microphone to make monster sounds. Like that's not good for anybody's work environment, right? But like when I can come in 10-20% of the time and like see folks and bounce ideas off and just have that team feeling, like that's the sweet spot for me.
Okay. I think we start a category of like really beginner newbie questions from me, okay? So
I love it.
I don't know and can't really like understand how it looks like to record and perform music for a game, because like I have this idea, for example, going to a concert and there's orchestra and like you can have a microphone and it's fine, right? But
Yeah,
it not happens like that for games where you have like sounds overlaying some instruments and like different things happening. So like can you walk me through the process of recording sounds and then like from, let's say, the recording, how does it look like, and then like to reach the final output when I have like a MP3 or like wave file.
sure. Yeah, I can do that. It varies like a lot of things in game audio. It varies a lot, right? So like your situation you described of like putting a mic in front of an orchestral performance, like that happens. Like that on some aspects of game audio, like that is exactly what is done. It's not the only thing. There's so much, that goes into like mixing the individual parts and like retakes and all these things. But like that is one way that can shake out. Um, I think it's helpful to talk about like especially in indie games where I work, where I'm not part of some huge music team usually. I'm usually kind of a one person shop. The different ways that music just in general gets put into my software of choice and then put into a game. So um, if I'm being really reductive, like the three main categories are synths, synthesizers, samplers, and then live performers. So synthesizer is anything that just makes the sound, generates the sound right then. I play a note on my keyboard or I click something on my mouse, and this synthesizer software literally produces a sound right then. It's producing various sound waves and smushing them together to make something unique. And that's a synthesizer. There's obviously physical real world versions of those that are like, keyboards you can buy and touch and carry around. And then there's software versions that I play my keyboard below the screen here and it's plugged into my computer and it just activates that specific synth that I have it hooked up to. So that's a synthesizer. When I want to record those, I literally just am sitting here at my desk at my software. Usually, I'll open a new track, I'll load a synth that I want to play into it. I'll spend all this time either finding a preset in that synth that's like close to the sound I want it to make. Most synthesizers come with hundreds of different presets that are different sounds that one synthesizer can produce. And then I will tweak it from there until it's what I want, or you can make a sound from scratch. I don't got that kind of time, so I often don't. I usually find a preset and then tweak it until it's something more custom. And some people just use the presets as they are, and that's okay too. Nothing wrong with that. And then I will hit record and just kind of play the part into my keyboard here at my desk. Usually I practice like a little bit, but often I like to just kind of record it. And then if I screw up, I can either record over it and try again, or more frequently, I record it. And then that botched recording is something adjustable with the synthesizer. It's not like, if I hire a violin player and they play something for me and there's a mistake in their part, they have to play it again, right? They have to re-record. Um, there's caveats to that too. You can kind of with modern software, you can take that one note and tweak it, but technically they have to re-record. But with the synthesizer, it's what's called MIDI, which is musical instrument digital interface. It's basically like sheet music for robots. And so I can take the notes I've recorded and move them around and change the length and change the velocity and the volume and all these things after I've written them down. Same way you would erase notes on a piece of physical sheet music and then rewrite them if you made a mistake. And then the part plays back the way I wanted. So I can either record things in by actually playing into my keyboard that's hooked into my computer, which is how I prefer to do things being a piano player. Other people prefer to kind of do the equivalent, the digital equivalent of like writing with
Okay.
pencil, which is like clicking things with your mouse and like, painting notes in with the cursor and then adjusting them that way. And I usually do like a combo. So that's synthesizers. Samplers are very similar, but a sampler is based on a real recording of an instrument. So if you have a sampler of a banjo, let's say, uh, the way that was constructed is they had an actual banjo player sit down in a studio and like play painstakingly like every note a banjo can play at every different volume. They may have included like finger, noises on the frets and like slides between notes. It's sounds like the worst job in the world,
Yeah,
frankly.
kind of. Yeah.
Making a sampler sounds like absolute hell. Um, just like squeezing every single sound out of an instrument individually that it can make. And then they compile it together and make a piece of software that basically an ape like me can play a note on my on my keyboard and then a banjo sound comes out. And then as I'm playing on a keyboard, which is a very different experience than playing a stringed instrument, the better the sampler is, the more organically like a real banjo it will sound. A live performer playing the real thing is almost always going to be better, but uh, depending on the type of instrument sampled and how painstakingly the sampler was mated. Some samplers sound really, really good. Like especially percussion. Percussion is kind of the thing where like a sampler can is basically indistinguishable. A real drummer is still going to be even better, but like because percussion is mostly like a short hit and not something like a violin that's very hard to sample, where it's like, yeah, you can play short staccato notes, but you can also play long expressive stuff and you can bend notes between other notes. And like sometimes you don't do that. And the bow can leave the strings at different velocities, creating different kind of like effects there. And like how do you compile all that stuff together in a way that's playable by Monkey Boy over here? And so so other than the way they're constructed, that's a very similar thing to recording a synthesizer. Like I can play it in. If I make mistakes, I can go back and tweak it. Or I do it. They take a lot more fiddling in my experience because a lot of samplers, even if they're very good, say you have a cello sampler that sounds a lot like a real cello, it usually doesn't sound a lot like a real cello when you initially play it with your keyboard. Like when you initially record it, it's like this is kind of obviously fake. You have to go in and use the additional controls to kind of like, okay, I want this note to organically portamento, like bend down into this note, the way a real string player would kind of like just bend the notes on the fretboard on the neck of the cello to make them kind of like blend in with each other. Like I need to manipulate the dynamics and add more or less kind of the sounds of the bow scraping the strings and stuff. You have to do a lot more kind of fiddling to make it sound like the real thing. but a good sampler will give you those tools that you can do. It's just a lot of them don't appear in the first playthrough. Uh, and then there's live performers that can either be me. Sometimes I will, like hook a microphone up to my piano or play my digital keyboard doubles as just a pretty nice sounding digital piano, and I'll play those directly in to my software. The difference there being that it is like an audio recording. It's the same as the recording of our voices right now. Like it is what it is. You can use some digital magic to kind of mess with it after the fact, but usually the best thing is like you want to get a take right. You want to
Yeah.
at least get a portion of your composition correct and sounding the way you want. And then you can edit multiple different segments of those takes together, which is very common in audio production. I forget the link to it, but like Billie Eilish randomly even did like a very good like breakdown of like you all know I don't sing these perfect every time, right? And like showed how many different takes she will do of a single vocal line. And then they will take like, okay, you got this syllable perfect here, but then the other syllable in that word wasn't as great as this other take where you did nail it. So we're going to splice those syllables together. So now the whole word sounds perfect. And it's just like extremely painstakingly like Frankensteining the best part of like 40 different passes at this together until you have one extremely good one. That's a common musician thing since, you know, ancient times. But I still think a lot of people don't realize like how much we do that. Like especially like when you see like a really incredible musician or like pop star like Billie Eilish or something, like they're great musicians, but we still do a bunch of passes at recording something and then staple together all the best parts and then people just think we're that good and it's like mm-mm. And so that will look like either me doing stuff or often hiring and working with performers who are usually remote. There have been a few cases where I work with people who are here in Seattle who I then go and kind of have like a session with directly. But a lot of times it's working with people who I've kind of cultivated relationships with from all over the country or international and being like, hey, here's what I need. And in that case, I either write them sheet music if they are a performer who prefers that, or to save time, a lot of performers I work with, I just kind of ask them straight up, like, are you cool with ear training this? And ear training means I will send you the audio of like the mock-up version of your part. It's like a sampled violin, but I want you to play real violin and play this part and do it better. Uh, and a lot of performers I work with are like, yeah, I can do that. And that's great for me because it saves me a lot of time making sheet music for people. I have no problem doing it for performers who prefer it, but it's been a very nice like kind of cheat to like get to
Yeah.
skip over that when they're like, yeah, I can just hear it and figure it out. Um, and so that kind of ends up being an iterative process because it'll be like I'll make the mock up for them. I do like the synthetic version of their part, sheet music potentially, and then some notes about like here's what I'm looking for. Where possible, even if it's remote, I'll have like a directing session with them where we'll meet over Zoom like this or something, and even have them like play little bits of it for me. And that way I can give notes in real time, like, ooh, can you put more expression on the end of this? Can you make it more legato, whatever? But the best thing for me in that case has just been cultivating like relationships with performers who I really trust. Um, and that way I feel like I get the best stuff when I give them more freedom instead of being more picky about what I want. It's like, here's the part. I trust you to kind of, here's the vibe. Like I'll give them kind of the basic, like, here's what we're going for. Here's what the game is about. Here's the impact I want this part to have. But you know your instrument way better than me. Like if I could play it, I would. I can't. Like I need, please help me. And so usually I ask them if they're comfortable, like, can you put the expression on this that you think is going to be the best fit based on what I've described to you? And I almost always get like an infinitely better performance that way than if I was just like, can you more portamento here? Can you ease off the bow there? Like that can be helpful, but I'm not a violinist, right? If I let a pro violinist, like a lady I work with a lot, her name is Lucia Lorezza, and she's incredible and she's very good at just being like, oh, I see what you want. And then just giving me something way better than what I could have possibly dragged out of her if I'd sat there and painstakingly been like, do this, but not this. Like, she's just like, I got you, boss. And she just like goes off and comes back with, I'm like, that's almost every time I'm like, that's way better than what I would have asked for. So, like, you
But
know,
does she then improvise in terms of you mean like she's changing the style but keeping the same, let's say, musical notes and everything, or is she doing like improvisation?
that's a good point. So usually what I mean is like changing the expression. So the notes are the
Okay.
same. You're mapping onto the part. I want you to play what notes you see when you see them. But the actual like how are you bowing this? Like when are you choosing to do like more emphasis on the strings? When are you choosing to be like more kind of lyrical and legato and that kind of thing? Like I set some parameters sometimes, like can you play this exactly as written, but then here you can kind of go crazy if you want. Um, but I have in the past, especially on Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, I have had parts where I'm like, here's the part that I wrote, and this is generally what I want. But where you feel comfortable adding embellishments that might include like notes that aren't normally there, or even I've had a few things where there's been like a solo part, uh, like one of the tracks from Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. There's a big like open area for like a huge trumpet solo. And good friend of mine, one of the other composers on Gunpoint who did the main theme, John Robert Matz, is an amazing trumpet player. And I was like, dude, whatever trumpet solo I write here is not going to be as good as what you could just pop off the top of your head. Are you cool with like when you play everything else kind of as written and embellish as you like, but then when you get here, can you just like go? And he was like, yeah. And then his solo there is completely just him. I didn't even write a part there. I was just like, this is just you do it. And it was way better than anything I could have come up with because I don't know the instrument, right? And he was doing like these growls through the horn and all these different like horn falls and stuff where I'm like, I'm a piano player. Like I push the button and the sound comes out, you know? So I was like, oh yeah, horn can growl. I forgot about that. And so like that's been super rewarding to work with performers who are down to do that kind of experimentation. Because I think some performers probably prefer it when someone's like, just give me the thing and tell me what you want. But I have been very lucky to find and work with people who are down to kind of let me put more of the expression specifics on them. Like tell them the basics and the vibe we're going for and stuff, but then be like, you know your instrument better. I'd love to hear what you would do based on what I've said. And I find I almost always get something way cooler and way
Nice.
more personal and way more interesting out of them when I do that. And so
Nice.
that's kind of the last step. And so we get all that stuff. It's synths, it's samplers that I'm recording, or it's live parts that I'm either importing into my software. I don't know why I said importing like that. Importing from people all over the country or stuff I've recorded live here. Uh, and then if you've never used a DAW, anybody listening, which is a digital audio workstation, it's the main type of software that composers and musicians use. If you hear anything audio, probably this show, I would imagine, like, is edited in a DAW of some
Oh
kind.
yeah, oh yeah, okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like if you use, I don't know what you do with this, if it's
DaVinci
GarageBand or
Resolve, but
Yep.
it
Yeah.
yeah.
So DaVinci Resolve has like basically the sound editing suite is like kind of a miniature DAW, essentially, 100%. So, but basically, like if you've ever seen GarageBand or anything, it's like that. We have all these horizontal tracks that you put different parts into, each one being usually one instrument or one musical part, and layer them all on top of each other till you have the whole song. And then from there, you can edit things, you can cut different parts out, you can splice things together, you can add all these different plugins, which is just what audio people call like the little internal pieces of software. Like I'm using Logic Pro as the DAW that I use, and inside of Logic Pro, there's all these different pieces of software like EQs and amplifiers and distortion plugins and all these different ways to change or manipulate the sound. And so we go through and do that to add character, and then we do the mixing and mastering phase, which is where we are trying to kind of make everything sound balanced, which usually means like once you record all the different parts for an entire song or piece of music, a lot of them sound like they're fighting each other. It's kind of like that thing I mentioned earlier with trying to make music and sound design live together. You'll have recorded all the parts, but then the bass guitar is really fighting with the low horns or with this low synthesizer. Like they're trying to live in the same space musically and play these really low sound. And so you do in the mixing phase stuff like EQing, where you're kind of sculpting the frequency range of different instruments to bring out the parts of them that are important. Like on a bass guitar, it'd be the low end we really want to hear. The bass guitar doesn't make a lot of high pitched like chirpy, bird music, right? So we can cut the low end of an EQ on a bass guitar, for example, because we don't care about that part as much. And you'd usually play it back as you're cutting it and listen and be like, okay, I'm going to cut up until the point where it starts to actually ruin the sound. And that way, we're losing a lot of frequencies that to our ear don't really add anything, but when you leave them in, they pile up over an entire composition until a lot of things that want to live in that high space, like a piccolo or something, is like, I am not getting heard very well because there's other instruments that are cluttering up this space, right?
Okay.
With sounds that we don't really care about as much. And so uh, that's EQing. Is It's kind of like sculpting and like bringing out the important parts of each sound and cutting the parts that don't matter as much so that other instruments that want to use that part of the frequency range And when I say frequency range, I literally just mean low sounds, medium sounds, high sounds, right? Like yeah, like pitch. Um, and so we do a lot of that stuff to balance everything, make sure things are the right volume. We do a lot of panning, which is to make things. Imagine your music is on a stage and you're deciding where physically on the stage each performer is going to be. Are they right in front of you? Are they off to the side? Do they move around during the performance? Which is a nice aspect of digital music. Like you don't go see a symphony and then like the orchestra plays and then partway through the movement like the flute player like dives across the stage and stands behind the tuba. That would be sick and I would love it, but it doesn't happen. Um, and that's fine. But in digital music, like we can have a flute player like say that their part is very key at that point in the track. I'd want them panned like so they sound like they're coming directly straight at me. And then later in the same piece of music, maybe the flute is a background part. I might pan it in between those moments so it's off to the side now, so it's not like coming right between my eyes. So that way, other parts of the track that are more important have that space to themselves. And so I could go on forever, but mixing is various elements of balancing things and making sure the right elements shine through, and the ones we don't care about get kind of brought down.
And
And then there's the
mastering?
mastering phase
Yeah.
is the last part, which is getting usually mastering is about getting everything on the same production. So this could be all the tracks on an album, all the pieces of music in a soundtrack, um, making sure they all sound like they live together. Because you can mix a track really, really well and have it sound great. And then if you haven't mastered everything on that soundtrack album, it's like, okay, this track sounds awesome by itself. But then when I listen to the next one, they have completely different characters. They sound completely different volumes from each other. Like these don't sound like they live together at all. And so it's the process of then going through the large form entire musical production and making sure everything sounds like it has the same kind of final coat of paint on it is a very loose way to put that. And making sure you're getting the maximum volume out of everything uh, without ruining the characteristic. Like obviously, if it's meant to be a quiet track, you don't want it to be blaring, but you want it to be as loud as it needs to be to still come through everything else you're going to hear.
Okay. Okay. Uh, you mentioned synths, samplers, and live performance. So one quick follow-up question. You can have in one track things from various sources, right? Like,
Yes.
okay, okay.
And
Just
often we do. Like
okay.
there are entire soundtracks that are just one. Like the Portal soundtrack is a good example. It's just synthesizer stuff. It
Oh,
sounds great.
okay.
So it's just one guy. Forgive me, I forget the composer's name at the moment, but just doing everything. It's all synthesizers, and you can have stuff that is all one thing. But a lot of the time, depending what you're doing, like it's kind of a mixture of everything. And even sometimes you'll layer them. Like a thing I do a lot is if I'm working with a live performer, I'll use violin again as an example. I'll get a really nice violin performance recorded by a live player. Sounds awesome. Sounds like exactly what I want. But then I put it in the composition as a whole, and it's not coming through quite as much. And it's not the performer's fault. It's just there's so much other stuff going on that I kind of need to like bump it up a little bit. And so sometimes what I'll do is I'll have a sampler or two sample violins play the exact same part, just mixed way down. So they're a lot quieter, but it's just kind of like helping to prop up. So we only really hear the live component, but it's like these sampled violins, they sound good enough if they're quiet and they kind of fill in the space. So it sounds like one heftier, more present violin, but still the part that the listener is catching is just the live performance element. So we're still getting all that expression and all the human element, but it's just kind of propped up a little bit in a way that's not really easy to pick out when you're just listening to it.
If you were to increase the volume, you wouldn't get the same effect.
That's a very good point. So sometimes, yes, just increasing the volume is what you need. But other times you end up, say it's meant to be a really quiet, kind of lyrical, soft emotional part. If I increase the volume too much to make sure it's coming through in the mix, now it sounds like a very soft, emotional, like romantic part being played really loudly at me for some reason. And that's not what we want. Like, so sometimes exactly that's all you need. But other times it's like, I want this to still have the character of something soft and, you know, more reserved, but shit, I can't hear it. So that's like a tactic I will use sometimes is like bring up the volume a little, but keep that character and then put fake violins underneath playing as close an approximation as I can get out of them, the same part. And that kind of helps add volume to something. I shouldn't use the word volume. Because I don't mean loudness. I mean like volume, like your hair can have volume in a shampoo commercial, you know?
Okay.
It adds breadth and like presence to something
Okay.
without actually making it louder,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Okay. Do you get to reuse sound assets you like recorded at some point? Mm, especially for sound effects, but also for music. Like, or do you have like your own library already, like built things, or is it more like for each game you need to kind of start almost from scratch?
That's a good one. I try to reuse stuff as much as I can without it sounding like I am a complete hack because um I'm sure you would agree games are very hard to make, and the more kind of shortcuts you can give yourself
Oh yeah.
means the more time you can spend, you know, putting that energy and time into making cool new stuff where it counts. But yeah, so especially in sound design, I reuse stuff all the time, and it doesn't necessarily mean you know, and this has happened too. But it doesn't necessarily mean, hey, I made this sound of like a flare gun going off, and let's just use it again in this game. I can do that if the game is like, say, the same developer, which I have done. Like if you played like West of Loathing and then our more recent game, Shadows over Loathing, which is the kind of Lovecraftian horror one, there are sounds from West of Loathing that are just wholesale just in Shadows over Loathing because they're just a really good fit, and it kind of just we looked into it, but it's like, does it make sense to make a new like punch sound effect for this like really basic punch sound? And it's like, no, the other one worked, and there's no reason to expect something different here, so we just kind of reuse it. Um, but more frequently, what this looks like is taking sound assets I've already recorded, because a lot of sound design is not going and recording something and being like, cool, I have the sound now. Like guns are a very famous example. I've never gone and live recorded guns, although I want to, like at a firing range or something. But guns in movies and video games, we expect them to sound a certain way. They have a lot of impact, they have a lot of heft to them, they have a lot of low end. They sound like little miniature cannons going off. And guns in real life are super loud, but otherwise super shitty and stupid sounding. They sound like a firecracker going off, but 100 times louder right next to your ear. So like it's like a really bad, lame sound that's just super loud. They don't actually sound cool like they do in the movies. And so when you record something like a gun, what they do is like they'll record as cleanly as they can the actual gun sounds. But then when I need to make weapon sound effects in a game, like just a standard pistol shot, usually it's that sound of an actual pistol going off. And then if I just stop there, it sounds really lame. Just it's like pop. It's like not, even though it's realistic, it's not good. And so I will add underneath it like the sound of literally like my oven door slamming is a big one that I do. I'll like slam my oven door, and that gives a lot of impact, and then I'll manipulate it so it doesn't sound like an oven door. And then I'll slam like my basement door, and then I'll like, one time I think I literally like took some of the metal stuff out of my toolbox and just kicked my like toolbox in my basement. Um, like sound design is stupid, okay? But that's usually what it looks like, is being like, okay, this recording is fine, but it needs these other elements. What can I do to give it the elements of like presence and, sounding large and sounding deep, things that we associate with guns in media, even though they don't really sound like that. Why am I going through all that? It's because those individual layers of things, like the recording of my oven door slamming, the recording of a pistol that I already had from a library or something, that stuff gets reused all the time. Like if I need to add a big like oomph sound to something like a sci-fi shuttle door slamming, or I need some more low end in like a spell like sound effect, like a like crackling like lightning spell effect or something. A lot of times my oven door is like the secret sauce, and I'm not gonna go record that guy again. I've already got a bunch of recordings of me voiding my renter's agreement. So I'm just going to like reuse those, but I'm using them that layer in a new way. It's not the same sound effect completely. It's just this layer adds a low kind of presence to something. And I'm going to slide that in, but combine it with new elements. It's an entirely new thing. Like I've never kept a record of it, but like the oven door example, if you cataloged everything I've used that in, it's been everything from like part of a gunshot, part of a spell effect, part of a monster growling. Like I'll take the oven door slam and like literally stretch the sound out until it doesn't sound like an impact anymore. It sounds like it sounds really garbled and awful, which is perfect for like a monster sound. Um, I think I've used it as a layer in like big clumpy like robot footsteps. Like it gets used for everything. And if I had to go re-record that layer every time I needed that specific type of oomph in something, like it would be pretty awful. And so in that way, like specific layers of a sound, because every piece of sound design is usually multiple layers, a lot of which are nonsense.
Mhm.
Those specific, like if you, the famous example a lot of people maybe know is like the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, right? It's like, how did they do that? And it's like, it's an elephant and a lion and a goose and the squeaky hinge on somebody's door and it's like all this random stuff. And then they manipulate all those layers and smush them together and it sounds like a T-Rex. Those individual layers are the kind of thing that I reuse all the time.
Okay. Okay. How do you know what kind of
Uh-oh.
things you need? Like for the T-Rex example, right? Like imagine you want to do a T-Rex and you now need like how do you come up with the lists of things you need for this like particular sound that is like made up out of almost like gazillion of other things and you need to tweak them to actually get the sound. So like for me, like you're kind of I need to get from point A to point B and I
Yeah.
don't see the path.
Point B is the T-Rex and point A is nothing. How do I,
Exactly.
yeah. Um, that is an awesome question because like I barely know the answer. Because and part of that is just me being a primarily a composer. As I said, I do sound design as well. But I'm not shy about, there are people who primarily do sound design who are much better at it than I am. And so part of it is just talking to other sound designers and being like, can you like getting people to deconstruct their own sounds and be like, oh, you can do that is huge. So that's part of it, just like realizing what's possible. A second thing is like I'm trying to be better about this myself, like finding time to cultivate time to like play with sound design. Like you're not making a sound for anything specific, just like record something. It could be like me like dinging my desk lamp like that, and then be like, how hard can I mangle that? I'm gonna take 20 minutes out of my work day today and be like, what can I do to make that sound not like I just flicked the metal dome on my desk lamp and like, you could pitch it way, way up or way, way down. When you do that, sounds change characteristic really drastically. Like if I pitch it way down, it might sound like hitting like the Liberty Bell or something, or it might not even sound like a bell ring at all. And then I can like time stretch it so it's way, way, way longer. And that usually is a great way to mangle a sound and make it sound like, okay, this doesn't sound like a sharp ding, like an impact anymore. It sounds like, it sounds like insanely different. It sounds like a rift opening or something. And then like what effects like distortion and EQing and ring and phase modulators and all these different sci-fi sounding things that we use to like more specifically manipulate a sound. What can I do on top of that? And just sort of seeing like one very, very simple thing without any additional layers. What can I do to mangle it? And I find that helpful when I remember to take the time to do that because it reminds me of what's possible so that I can think more organically in that way instead of just being like, I need this kind of layer for this thing, but I don't know what. Like that reminder of like, hey, it doesn't have to sound like that to start. Like I can take something sharp and impactful and change it. But the biggest thing is just like really breaking, and I learned this from sound designers way smarter than me. So credit to the rest of that part of the industry, I guess. Just learning how to break sounds down into their components. Like the I'll use the movie gunshot example again. Like somebody fires a pistol in a movie, and it's easy, especially for me when I was not doing sound design. It was easy for me to go like, yeah, I need a gunshot. Like if I was going to make a gunshot, I'd be like, I need a gunshot sound. Where get? And you can get libraries of pre-made sounds that can use free use in things that are licensed to be used and stuff. So I could do that. But if I wanted to make one, I'd be like, I need a gunshot. And early days, I would have thought like I need to record a gun. And that would have been where I would have probably learned if I hadn't already that like, oh, guns sound very loud, but very bad and stupid and lame in real life. So in a movie, like learning to break down that pistol shot in a film, but like, okay, it's the metal click of the trigger and the click of the hammer coming down. Like you usually hear that the ka-chink, like that metal sound. I need something clicky and metallic. That could be me kind of manipulating my keys near a microphone, like just kind of pressing my thumb on them to make metal clicks. It could be I made a bolt action like old timey like World War II rifle sound once. You know, they have that like like that cool bolt action sound that I really like. There's a similar like bolt lock on the door to my basement, uh, which feels like a pretty. That's as close as a one to one as I ever get. Is like, I need a bolt, I find a bolt, you know. But I like manipulated that, like going on my basement door, and then it still doesn't sound quite right, but you like okay, this is pretty close. It gives me the metal scraping and the clickiness and the impact thunk of it sliding into place, and then from there I can EQ it and pitch shift it and change it and add things to it to make it sound like a hefty, chunky bolt action lever on a rifle. Um, Going back to that pistol thing, there's the sound of the crack of the initial like bullet coming out. That could be a real gun recording that you use. It could be, you know, a combination of layering things like snapping your fingers or I don't know, like a nutcracker, a cracker, a firework, all kinds of different things. Um, but then also like if you listen in a lot of movie guns, there will be like this big kind of like very quick like rumble sound underneath a bullet firing to add more weight to it that guns don't really do. There will be like the echo, like the kind of sound of the gunshot, the report, especially if like you fire it outside, there'll be like the report like fading off into the distance and kind of like doing that Doppler effect. You want to add some reverb plugins and some spatializing so it sounds like the sound you're making is really in a large space like that. Otherwise, it sounds like you fired a gun in a closet and it doesn't matter how cool it is. It sounds kind of lame. Um, so it's just getting it is a thing that took me a lot of practice, and I'm still honestly working at it frequently. But getting used to hearing any sound, or even harder, imagining a sound if there isn't this, you know, like making a gunshot in a game is like at least I know what a gunshot should sound like in media. Like if it's like here, this wizard casts like a curse on somebody, make a sound for that. It's like I don't know what a curse spell sounds like. You know, you can find examples, but you're kind of got to make that up. And so then it's sort of doing it from the other end. It's not deconstructing a sound that exists. It's going, okay, I want a low, menacing sort of rumble, and I want sort of this is where sound design starts to sound really stupid, like glittery, like sparkly, you know, elements. And like, what could those be? It could be wind chimes. It could be me flicking my fingers across the ends of the tines on my like metal rake in the garage. It could be me. We use a lot of music tools in sound design. Even people who don't also do music like me, we use a lot of like synthesizers and stuff to be like, I'm not going to make a musical sound. I'm not going to play a chord or a scale or a specific melody, but I'm going to go like draw my finger up the keyboard like this and go like, brrr, and then like
Yeah.
record that and then manipulate that and get like, you know, use synthesizers and samplers as a tool in sound design the same way you would go out and record stuff in the real world and smash it together. So I'd say that's the most key thing is just like continuing to practice. At least for me, it was a lot of practice and continues to be like deconstructing sounds that already exist that you want to make in your thing, or like constructing from scratch layer by layer a new sound that you want to make instead of trying to think, I need to make a spell. Oh no, I'm ruined. Everyone will find out I'm a fraud. It's like I need to make a spell. Can I come up with like 5 or 6 layers that I would describe as being elements of a spell sound? No matter how goofy or stupid it might sound, to write down like tinkly, sparkly, warbly, you know, that's usually what it is. And then being like, okay, what kinds of things in my environment can I record or get recordings of that are these elements? And then manipulate them with software, change the way they sound, smush them together, layer them on top of each other, and then often be like, okay, if I mute these middle 2 layers, everything else sounds pretty good so far. But the thing with my car keys and the thing with my car antenna like didn't work at all. So I got to scrap those and find something else, you know, and you kind of keep slotting things in until you land on like, cool, that sounds like a spell.
Mhm. Can you extract a skill out of it? Like, because it feels like a lot of trial and error, but do you feel you get better over time in doing this?
I'm tempted to say no, but if I'm being honest, if I'm being honest with myself, yes, you absolutely get better at it. Like,
Okay.
and I can say that I think I can say this comfortably as someone who has primarily been a musician my whole life, and so sound design is in terms of my whole life a relatively newer thing for me. You know, I've been doing it for years now, but it's I know sound designers who've been doing sound design since they were young and just have this naturally. And for me, it's an acquired thing that I'm still working on, where it's like I will hear a cool sound in something. Like my wife and I are watching a movie or something and hear a cool sound. And my sometimes, if I'm lucky, my brain will automatically go, oh, cool. Like this layer that I'm hearing, like I may be wrong, but just thinking in this term of like that could be like a guitar string being snapped. This could be like, the turn signal on someone's car. Like, you start to think of like the layers of something. And uh especially for the opposite where you need to make a sound from scratch that doesn't map onto a real world thing. Um, I find that much more difficult. Uh, Getting decent at being able to think of it in layers that you construct one at a time, like elements of a sound instead of I need a sound for this. Like that is definitely a skill that you can practice and get better at. Like 100% it is. It just is, it takes a while. And I think as someone who's doing that more recently in my career, again, years of sound design experience now, but still like on the grand scheme, more recently than many, um, I'm noticing that like the more I do it, the more I'm able to go like, oh, cool, you need a spaceship engine. I can instantly think of like five elements of what that would be, you know, and they're loose elements, and then we fill them in and try to make them different and unique for that spaceship engine versus another one. But um, yeah, just getting used to zooming in on audio as an idea, because I think in daily life, even as a musician, we don't normally do that. We don't normally think of a sound and go, what are the pieces of this? We go like, yeah, a bird's chirping. Like, why would I extract that? It's like, yeah, but the sound of the bird is echoing in the trees, and the bird has an initial kind of sharp attack and then like a warble after, and like there's kind of multiple notes coming at the same time out of its beak. And, you know, you can drive yourself crazy real quick if you like do it too much, but it's really fun when like you actually do it with intention, I feel like.
Okay. I already dragged you through a lot of things, so maybe I won't ask you like one by one, but I want to shout out a couple of tracks, mostly from Where the Water Tastes Like Wine,
Sure.
my favorite ones. And if there are stories, you can pick, for example, one of them or two of them. And if there are stories or things you can tell me about them, I would love to hear more details. Like these five tracks, I will say in a second. This is like 20% of my music listening from 2024, according to Spotify Wrapped. So like,
Heck yeah.
I
You're like
like
personally responsible for
exactly,
how validating my Spotify Wrapped was
exactly.
like in the
You
last couple of years. It's like
you
your top
think
listeners are this one guy in Poland.
yeah,
I'm like,
exactly.
huh.
And then like, probably like you think like, oh, so many hours people have listened. They must have been like hundreds of people. It's like just me, like play on the repeat.
I'll take it.
So so
If you're the entirety of my Polish fan base, I'll take it.
the tracks are Miles of Smiles, Noodle It Out, Rail Hoppin', Read 'em and Weep, Vagrant Song, and Ballad of the Bog from a different game. Do you have any stories or uh, info? How were they made? Some interesting things to talk about.
Sure. Yeah, totally. Is it cool if I go in any order just to make sure we hit
Of
kind of the
course,
biggest ones?
of course.
Um, so I want to start with Vagrant Song, which you mentioned from Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, because that's one of my favorite things that I ever got to work on. And that actually is a great example of the thing I mentioned earlier in the show, where because I was brought on so early onto that game's production, like I got to suggest and kind of prototype the way that this specific track works in game and do it early enough that we actually got to like implement it. And it was really satisfying to kind of see this come together. And it was largely because I was brought on so early that like we had room for it uh, to prototype it and make it work. So the idea with Vagrant Song is again, where the water tastes like wine. You're this cursed kind of skeletal figure wandering the American countryside during largely the Great Depression, talking to people and sharing stories, and you know, hopping box cars and camping outside and that kind of thing. And I had this idea for this track where I was like, I really love that this game is about telling stories, and it's partially about how stories change and have a life of their own, right? Somebody hears a story around a campfire and then they tell it in another town, but maybe they change it a little, make it more personal, and then another person shares it and it changes over time, right? And that's literally part of what the game is about, is that very idea. And like sometimes you'll hear the same stories that you've told other characters come back at you, but they've changed now. And I think that's really cool. And I was like, I want to do the musical version of that. because that, especially with folk music, which is what the soundtrack was, based on, was largely like American folk music. That's the thing that happens all the time. Is somebody would, you know, especially in the times before we had like industrial recording for music, somebody would play a song, you know, campfire or in a boxcar or, you know, at an encampment or something, and then other people would learn it, but they'd play it their own way, and then they'd travel and they'd play it for other people, and it would keep changing and morphing to kind of suit the musicians and the culture that they pass through. And I just think that's such a cool idea. And so I pitched the idea of like, what if we had one song that did what the stories in this game do, and it changes and it shifts depending where you are in the country, because the game's overworld is literally just a huge map of America that you're literally like walking on the map, right? So you're walking over the Pacific Northwest or walking over like the Deep South and like Georgia and Florida and Alabama and stuff. I was like, what if this one song is ostensibly the same song, but it keeps changing based on where you are to reflect like how these different cultures would get a hold of this song and change it for themselves. And thankfully, the devs thought this was a cool idea, and this is an example of getting to work with one of many examples on this game, but getting to work with musicians from different backgrounds all over the country who were able to kind of bring their own thing to it and understand like what was needed. So for like the Northeast, I did five versions of the song. It was the Northeast, the Deep South, the Midwest, the West Coast, and the Southwest of America. And so, like for the Northeast version, I wanted it to sound very kind of like, you know, like the like kind of New England mixed with like Appalachian sound. So a lot of like banjo and kind of like wash tub bass and like washboard and kind of these like a lot of the almost like found instruments that people in that time would use and that still kind of exist in a lot of like bluegrass music from the area today. And so I worked with a performer named Jillian Aversa, who I recommend checking out. By the way, she's an incredible singer. She doesn't normally do music like this. She's got a very like operatic, kind of vocal style. But I was like, hey, do you think you could do like a, like a Appalachian sort of country like take on this track? And she was like, sure. And she aced it and like really like nailed sounding like, she's from that area. And, so we used different instrumentation there to like the banjo and the washboard and all these kinds of like, I think I literally flipped over a tub in my like a metal bin in my garage and like tapped out some of the percussion for one of the takes on that. And so that was that area. But then we get to the Deep South, which is my favorite version of this track, and I just wanted like a really like slow, like wandering kind of cowboy like track for this, like just guitar and like really soulful, morose vocals, because that's the area where you were most likely to see somebody just playing a guitar around a campfire and singing this song, because that was the instrument that was prevalent in that area of the country at, obviously all over the place now, but at that time, like people would wander and play their guitar and like that was their one companion. And so I worked with a performer named Joshua Duchesne, who's still one of the most talented people I've ever worked with. He's an incredible guitar player, incredible singer, and is all over that soundtrack. Like if you like the Where the Water Tastes Like Wine soundtrack, anytime you hear guitar, mandolin, or almost any male vocals on that soundtrack, it's him. And it doesn't sound like it's the same guy. He's like incredible at changing his voice, but it is almost entirely him doing a lot of the performances, and he just killed it. And so on this one, he did this very like soulful, based on the guitar part I wrote for him. But that was another example of him doing a lot of embellishments and like, you know, uh, just slightly tweaking the guitar part I wrote to make it more soulful and more organic to someone who is a lifelong guitar player. Uh, and so again, it's the same song. It's the same lyrics. Mostly, we changed a couple of the lyrics because again, lyrics would change too as the song travels. But it's mostly the same lyrics, it's the same structure, but it's an entirely different feel. Uh, in the Midwest, I worked with a for the Midwest version, rather, I worked with an actual opera singer named Elizabeth Zaroff, who Midwest, not exactly like in folk time, in Great Depression times, known for their opera, but uh, again, I wanted to see if she could, I was like, hey, you're an incredible singer. Can you give me kind of like the Midwest of America has, for viewers who aren't from America, like maybe not aware, has a lot of Scandinavian like immigrant background. Me being from there, I have a lot of like Swedish and Norwegian and stuff in me, and there's just a lot of background of people from that part of the world migrating there. And so I was like, can we do like a Scandinavian like uh intoned like version of this track? And so I had like Scandinavian style like dulcimer and Scandinavian like hand drum percussion for this. And she's also has that kind of background where she's from, and so she did a very good job of like singing this with that kind of like vocal intonation, like singing it in the style of like folk Scandinavian singers, and even kind of changing the way she pronounced words and stuff to kind of fit. And I just thought it was a really cool, way to call back to, kind of the foundations, at least immigration foundations, because obviously, another spoiler for America, there were people there before anybody came over here, but at least kind of calling back to the immigration that happened there and kind of a lot of that. Um, in the Southwest, that was the one I needed the most help with because I wanted it to reflect a lot of the Mexican and otherwise like South American immigration that influences so much of that part of my country. And I was like, again, I'm a white dude from Minnesota. I was like, I am not going to get this right if I don't get help. And so I worked with two really great performers, Jose Daniel Ruiz and May Claire LaPlante, who both sing on the track. And Jose specifically not only helped me write the guitar parts in a way that fit with the musical traditions of Mexico, but also translated the lyrics into Spanish. And they sing that one in Spanish, which is like really what I wanted. I was like, the only way this is appropriate is if we sing it in Spanish because there's such a tradition of that in this area of the country. And it was so cool to hear it. Again, it's the same lyrics, it's the same words, but like translated it into a Spanish and South American kind of vocal styling. And I thought was so cool. And then for the final one on the West Coast, I was like, what can I do that's different over here that I haven't done vocally? And the thing I thought of was like, people like in the gold rush like would play a lot of instruments, but there was a lot more of like an instrumental kind of tradition with that. Like people from all these different camps are like camping by, a river where they're panning for gold or whatever at night, and just everybody breaks out instruments and kind of starts playing together. And I was like, let's do an instrumental one. Let's do one that doesn't have any vocals. And so I got to work with a string quartet that I really love and have was like a huge fan of before this game, called the Videri String Quartet. Again, look them up if you want, listeners. Like they do like really great like Zelda arrangements and stuff. They're just really incredible. And I was like, can you all once again just begging my performers, like, do what I say but better, please. Uh can you all pretend like you're all, just at an encampment and you just met each other and you all break out string instruments and just start kind of jamming? Can you treat it like you're not? Weirdly, I asked this incredible string quartet, like, can you pretend you're not professionals? And like, like play bad but not too bad. Like play amazing like you do, but just like try to make it more informal. And they just like aced it. Like they did so much work on that. They even helped me make the string arrangements because they did want sheet music, but they helped me as a someone who is not traditionally a string writer. Like I write for strings a lot, but like they are the experts. And so they were like, hey, we want to change the bowing here. We want to make this more appropriate. And I was like, heck yeah, let's go. And so, you know, and what came out of that was a really cool, like just it sounds like a bunch of people breaking out like violins and string instruments around a campfire, just kind of jamming out, and it's exactly what I wanted. So it's one of my favorite things I ever got to do because it's technically one song, but there's five versions, and it just gradually changes in game as you kind of walk from one region of the country to another. You'll hear the song continue to play, but just shift into the new version, and I'm really happy with it. That was a lot on one thing. Do you want me to go into others? Do we have time?
Do you know how long are we going?
I can go a little past one. I can go
Uh,
like to 115, 120.
how much time it is? Because I don't have
Oh
a
yeah, sorry.
clock.
That's like 40 minutes from now.
Okay, okay. Then let's do another one, and then we'll close.
Okay. Let me see. Um, oh, okay. I think I would talk about probably Miles of Smiles is another one that like I'd like to touch on. Like
Yeah,
all of these have some kind of story, but that one is another track from Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, and like a lot of the music in that game, most of the tracks in that game focus on a specific character, like they're related to one person that the player meets and shares stories with. And so Miles of Smiles was for a character in the game named Franklin, who is a uh, black man who is working as a Pullman porter, which is somebody who was hired to like ride around on trains in that time in like the 1920s and 30s, like post-slavery America, and deal with passengers' bags, prepare the sleeping cars, like shine shoes, like that kind of thing. Like they just traveled around with the trains, like kind of seeing to the mostly white passengers and seeing to their needs and like keeping the sleeping cars and stuff. And so they're very nomadic just by the nature of their job. Like they're always on the move and they don't really have like a stable kind of living space. And what's cool is this character this specifically is part of what was called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was a real thing in America, and it's often cited as the first all-black union in the country. It was like the first group of workers of black descent who got together and were like, we're gonna band together and use our communal power to like fight for our rights on this job because they barely had any. And so um, it was this track where I was trying to both like lend respect to all of that history that's inherent in this character, but also just kind of like convey the chaotic nature of like working any kind of service job, but especially like, the closest thing we have now, I think, would be like flight attendants, right? Where you're just like, you're literally most of your job is on a vehicle, it's crowded, it's noisy, people are always needing stuff from you, and like you don't have a very stable home base. You're always getting off a train and you're somewhere new and you just kind of got to like make the best of it and then start over the next day. And so I had a lot of fun trying to make a track that sounded like it was just on rails, and trying to make it sound like it was of this like 1920s kind of aesthetic. So I threw like a little bit more jazz in there, like kind of trying to mimic some of the music that some of these trains had. Like you were rich enough that they had bands and stuff who actually played on them. So I was trying to kind of mimic some of the music you might actually hear on these trains, played for some of the patrons, but then like make it sound chaotic and jostling. Like I literally started with just this piano line that's like ba-dee-ba-dee-boo, and I was just like, what can I do? I was just like noodling around on the piano. I'm like, what can I do that kind of sounds like a vehicle like bouncing on the rails? And like imagining everybody on board, like, drinks are spilling and like people are dropping stuff, and it's just like this big chaotic, extremely difficult job. And I started with that, and I was like, okay, this is hitting the right vibe for me because it's both it feels like a bouncing vehicle because sometimes music is just that dumb where it's like this sounds like wheels, that's just what it is. Like I'm not gonna lie to you, sometimes that's all it is. It's just like this sounds like rails. And then so it sounded chaotic and frenetic, but it also had the kind of jazz elements of the time period. It sounded like I was trying to kind of, the best way I can describe it is like make it fun and make it exciting because it is a job that's constantly moving, but also like try to evoke the like the people who did this job were basically invisible, right? Like they are working for largely white patrons, and they're just the help, right? You don't really look at them; they're not really seen. They had to band together for communal like workers' rights for a reason because they're just like basically invisible and it's just like do the job and don't bother me. And so I wanted it to almost sound like the song was ignoring them in a way. I wanted it to sound like it was kind of doing like the high flying jazz of like the 1920s that like the passengers of this train would be enjoying, and then still like try to make it sound chaotic and make it sound like in the background like you're just always hearing this driving bass line and driving piano rhythm that's just always chugging along. And in my brain, I think at the time that was like representing like these people are always here though. Like you can listen to the like flashy like brass and like the high notes and stuff and like really kind of just enjoy it for like it being like this kind of big band jazz piece, but that driving rhythm section is always there. And that to me was like that's these people who are just always in the background, like always busting their butt, and this whole track would fall apart if they weren't there.
Okay. That's so much more deeper than I thought. You like
Well, I'm glad you picked these because sometimes like you could have easily picked tracks that I've done where I'm like, I just thought xylophone sounded cool. I don't know. So like sometimes it's not. I got lucky that you picked ones where I like really thought about it.
Ryan, thank you so much for joining
Thank
me.
you.
And like, you went quite deep into a lot of things that I had no clue about, and I learned a lot. And thank you so much for joining me and sharing these stories and for your work. Like, to me, your work is incredible. I spent sick amount of time listening to this,
I love to hear it.
and I actually played the game where the water tastes like wine just before I had a trip to Croatia by car. So from Poland, like 20
Oh,
hours.
cool.
And it was like non-stop. My friends like had to listen to it like non-stop. 20 hours there, 20 hours back. Like I can't tell even how many times I put on the album. Like to me, it's great. Thank you so much
That
for work.
that genuinely means a lot, like truly. And thank you so much for having me on. I really I mentioned it before, but I really love getting to usually when I do an interview like this, it's with either kind of a journalistic publication or like another audio person, which is cool. But like I really like the opportunity to talk to someone who is an engineer and understands an aspect of making games and doing this kind of work that I interact with all the time, but I don't really. And it's just cool to see the kind of like cross disciplinary interest that I'm always screaming at people about. And it was very cool to talk to you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Game Engineering Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and follow on Spotify and other podcasting platforms. See you in the next episode.